In this episode, we take a set of names that can feel like a wall of alphabet soup to beginners and turn them into a practical skill, mapping standards and frameworks so you can understand what they are asking for, how they overlap, and how a security program proves coverage without doing the same work 5 times. SecurityX includes this topic because mature security is not only about choosing good controls, but also about demonstrating that those controls meet external expectations from customers, regulators, and business partners. Different organizations and industries prefer different standards, and you may inherit requirements from contracts or markets even if you never set out to follow a particular framework. That reality can feel overwhelming until you realize most of these standards are asking for similar outcomes, just organized in different ways and written for different audiences. We are going to discuss what each named framework is generally about, how to think about them as categories rather than trivia, and how control mapping lets you build one coherent program that satisfies multiple expectations. The goal is not to memorize every clause, but to develop the ability to look at an obligation, identify the control themes behind it, and show how the program already covers it. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Mapping begins with a mindset shift. Standards and frameworks are descriptions of security outcomes and management practices, not separate security programs you must build from scratch for each label. When a customer asks for SOC 2 reporting or a contract references PCI DSS, it does not mean you throw away your existing program and start over. It means you need to show how your current controls align to a defined set of criteria, and you may need to close gaps where your controls do not meet the required depth or evidence expectations. Beginners often treat standards as competing rulebooks, but the more accurate view is that they are lenses. One lens emphasizes payment card security, another emphasizes information security management, another emphasizes trust criteria for service organizations, and so on. Mapping is how you translate between lenses. The reason SecurityX cares is that mapping is a program management skill. It reduces duplicated effort, improves consistency, and produces traceability from requirement to control to evidence. When you can map well, you can answer exam scenarios about multiple obligations without panicking because you recognize the common control themes beneath the different names. Before we talk about specific frameworks, it helps to define what a control map actually is in a practical sense. A control map is a structured connection between requirements and the controls your organization uses to meet them, along with evidence that those controls are operating. The requirement might be written in a standard, a contract, or a regulation. The control might be a process like access review, a technical safeguard like encryption, or an operational practice like incident response. Evidence might be logs, tickets, review records, training completion records, or audit reports. The map answers questions like which controls address this requirement, who owns those controls, how often they are performed, and what proof exists. Beginners sometimes think mapping is about paperwork, but mapping is a tool for clarity. If you can map, you can spot gaps early, you can avoid building redundant controls, and you can explain security in language stakeholders understand. On SecurityX, you will often see questions about meeting multiple requirements efficiently, and the best approach usually involves mapping and consolidating rather than building separate siloed efforts. PCI DSS is a standard focused on protecting payment card data, and the easiest way to understand it is that it sets specific security expectations for environments that store, process, or transmit payment card information. Because payment card fraud has real financial consequences, the standard is detailed and tends to emphasize strong controls around network security, access control, monitoring, vulnerability management, and secure handling of cardholder data. Beginners sometimes assume PCI DSS applies to every organization, but it primarily applies when you are in the card payment ecosystem, either directly or through service providers. The security significance of PCI DSS in mapping discussions is that it is often more prescriptive, meaning it can require specific types of evidence and control implementation depth. If you are mapping to PCI DSS, you often focus on scoping, meaning identifying which systems are in the cardholder data environment and ensuring controls are tight there. Even without memorizing details, you can reason about what PCI DSS expects, restrict access, segment sensitive environments, monitor activity, manage vulnerabilities, and protect data. On exam questions, if you see payment card context, you should expect stronger confidentiality, integrity, and logging expectations, and mapping helps you show how those expectations are met. ISO/IEC 27000 is associated with an information security management system approach, which means it emphasizes building a structured program with policies, risk management, governance, and continual improvement. Beginners often misinterpret ISO as a list of technical controls, but the heart of ISO/IC 27000 is management discipline, defining scope, assessing risk, choosing controls, documenting decisions, and running a cycle of improvement. This is why ISO is often used by organizations that want a globally recognized way to demonstrate program maturity. In mapping terms, ISO often acts like a program framework that organizes how you manage security rather than prescribing a specific configuration. It also tends to emphasize that controls should be selected based on risk, not copied blindly. When you map controls to ISO expectations, you are often demonstrating that you have a coherent governance system, that you maintain policies and procedures, and that you have evidence of ongoing review and improvement. SecurityX questions may contrast a checklist approach with a management system approach, and ISO thinking typically aligns with the management system model. The key for beginners is to recognize ISO as a structured program lens, not just a technical recipe. SOC 2 is often used by service organizations to demonstrate that they manage security and related trust outcomes in a controlled, auditable way, typically for customers who rely on their services. SOC 2 is organized around trust service criteria, and the core idea is that a service provider can produce an independent report showing controls exist and are operating effectively over time. Beginners sometimes confuse SOC 2 with a certification you simply obtain, but it is more accurate to think of it as an evidence-centered reporting framework. Mapping for SOC 2 emphasizes documenting controls, operating them consistently, and collecting evidence that an auditor can evaluate. It also emphasizes that the scope matters, meaning the report applies to defined systems and services. In practical terms, if a company provides a cloud service and wants customers to trust it, SOC 2 can be a way to provide reassurance through structured control descriptions and evidence. On SecurityX, scenarios might involve a company trying to prove trustworthiness to customers, and the best answer often involves aligning controls to a reporting framework and ensuring evidence is reliable. For mapping, SOC 2 often drives you to strengthen consistency and evidence quality, not just implement new controls. NIST Cybersecurity Framework, NIST CSF, is best understood as a high-level framework for organizing security activities into functional categories that help an organization manage risk. Beginners often think a framework must be a strict list, but NIST CSF is more like a structured vocabulary that helps organizations describe what they do and identify gaps. The familiar functional areas are often summarized as identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, which is a useful mental model for seeing security as a lifecycle rather than as a pile of controls. In mapping terms, NIST CSF helps you categorize controls and show coverage across the full lifecycle. For example, asset inventories and risk assessments map to identify, access controls and training map to protect, monitoring and logging map to detect, incident response plans map to respond, and backups and recovery testing map to recover. The mapping benefit is that you can quickly see whether your program overinvests in one function and neglects another. SecurityX likes this kind of thinking because it supports prioritization and program balance. When you see questions about building a comprehensive security program, NIST CSF provides a way to reason about completeness without needing a long list of specific controls. CS controls, CIS, are often presented as a prioritized set of security controls that organizations can implement to reduce common risks. Beginners sometimes treat them as yet another compliance list, but the distinctive value of CIS is the emphasis on practical, actionable controls that address common attack patterns. In mapping discussions, CS can function as a baseline control catalog that you can align to broader frameworks. For example, you might map CS activities to NIST CSF categories, and you might map them to evidence requirements for SOC 2 or to technical expectations for other standards. CS is also helpful for beginners because it tends to translate abstract security goals into concrete control areas like inventory, secure configuration, vulnerability management, and account controls. The mapping lesson here is that you can use CS as a control backbone, then show how that backbone supports multiple external frameworks. SecurityX scenarios might describe an organization seeking a practical baseline, and CS is often a good answer because it offers a structured starting point without requiring a full management system overhaul. In exam thinking, CS often aligns with pragmatic control implementation and prioritization. Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, appears in this list because cloud changes the shared responsibility picture and introduces control considerations that are different from traditional on-prem environments. CSA resources often focus on cloud-specific best practices, control guidance, and assurance approaches that help organizations evaluate cloud services and manage cloud risk. For beginners, the key is that cloud introduces new forms of dependency and new control boundaries, like reliance on provider-managed infrastructure, use of managed services, and rapid scaling. Mapping CSA guidance helps ensure your cloud security practices cover those realities, such as identity management, configuration governance, data protection, monitoring, and vendor assurance. CSA is often relevant when organizations need to demonstrate cloud security posture to customers or when they need a cloud-focused control set to complement more general frameworks. SecurityX scenarios may involve cloud adoption and the need to map controls to cloud expectations, and CSA is a natural lens for that. In mapping terms, CSA can add cloud-specific depth to a program that also uses broader frameworks like NIST CSF or ISO. The overarching skill is recognizing that cloud introduces different risk patterns, and cloud-focused guidance helps map controls appropriately. Now let's pull these together into a coherent mapping approach that avoids duplication, because that is what the exam is really aiming at when it asks about standards and frameworks together. The first step is to define scope, meaning which systems, services, and data are included in the mapping. PCI DSS is often tightly scoped to cardholder environments. SOC 2 is scoped to specific services, and ISO scopes to the Information Security Management System boundaries. Without scope, mapping becomes meaningless because you might claim coverage based on controls that do not actually apply to the relevant systems. The second step is to establish a control catalog, meaning the set of controls your organization actually performs and how they are owned and evidenced. CS can help as a baseline catalog, while NIST CSF can help categorize the catalog. The third step is to map external requirements to that control catalog, identifying which controls satisfy which requirements and where gaps exist. The final step is to align evidence collection, so one set of evidence can support multiple requirements rather than collecting different proof for each framework. This sequence turns mapping into a management process, not a one-time chart. A common beginner trap is thinking mapping means forcing a perfect one-to-one relationship, as if every requirement maps to exactly one control and every control maps to exactly one requirement. In reality, many controls satisfy multiple requirements, and many requirements require multiple controls to be satisfied fully. For example, access control obligations might require identity management, role definition, review processes, logging, and incident response readiness, not just one setting. Mapping is therefore more like building a web of connections than drawing a single line. Another trap is treating the most detailed framework as the only one that matters, which can lead to overbuilding controls in areas that are not the highest risk for the organization. A mature approach uses mapping to support risk-based prioritization. You identify overlapping requirements and implement strong shared controls that satisfy multiple expectations, while also adding targeted controls where a specific framework is more demanding. SecurityX questions may present options that either treat each framework as separate or treat mapping as a shortcut without evidence. The best answer usually emphasizes consolidated controls with traceable evidence. Evidence is where mapping becomes real, because without evidence, mapping is just a story. Evidence can be operational, like access review records and incident tickets, and it can be technical, like protected logs and configuration baselines. Evidence also has freshness, meaning evidence needs to be current enough to prove controls are operating in the relevant time frame. SOC 2 in particular is evidence-driven, but all frameworks ultimately require proof. Beginners often assume an auditor only cares that a policy exists, but a mature assessment cares that the policy is followed and that exceptions are managed and documented. This is where governance tools, workflow automation, and continuous monitoring can support mapping by making evidence collection repeatable and reliable. SecurityX scenarios often describe audit fatigue, missing evidence, or inconsistent control operation, and mapping combined with disciplined evidence practices is the remedy. When evidence is tied to mapped controls, reporting becomes easier, and the organization can answer customer questions without scrambling. Mapping also helps you explain compliance impacts in plain language, which is a skill SecurityX values because security leaders must translate technical controls into business assurance. When leadership asks what it means to align with a framework, a good answer connects it to outcomes. We can identify assets and risks, we can protect sensitive data, we can detect and respond to incidents, and we can prove our controls operate. When a customer asks for a specific standard, a good answer shows that the organization has mapped requirements to controls and can provide evidence, rather than giving vague promises. This is also where cross-jurisdiction realities matter, because requirements can vary by region, and mapping helps you track which controls satisfy which regional obligations. The exam is not expecting you to be a lawyer, but it does expect you to recognize that mapping supports consistent control operation across varying requirements. When you can explain mapping as a method for reducing duplication, improving clarity, and strengthening assurance, you are demonstrating program-level maturity, which aligns with what SecurityX is designed to measure. As we wrap up, mapping standards and frameworks is about building one coherent security program that can satisfy multiple external expectations through shared controls and reliable evidence. PCI DSS emphasizes protecting payment card environments with detailed control expectations and careful scope, while ISO/IEC 27000 emphasizes a management system that drives governance, risk-based control selection, and continual improvement. SOC 2 emphasizes independent reporting and evidence that controls operate effectively over time for defined services. NIST CSF provides a high-level lifecycle vocabulary that helps balance the program across identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. CIS provides a practical, prioritized control baseline that can serve as a backbone for implementation and mapping. CSA adds cloud-focused guidance that helps ensure the program addresses shared responsibility and cloud-specific risk patterns. When you define scope, build a control catalog, map requirements to controls, and align evidence collection, you turn framework names from confusing labels into useful lenses. SecurityX rewards this approach because it shows you can manage security as a scalable program with traceability, rather than as a series of disconnected checklists.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.